last few lectures, we have been talking about past and present international monetary arrangements. These arrangements were undertaken to solve the nth country problem. The nth country problem is that the number of countries are larger than the number of independent exchange rates. As a result, there is interdependence among the economies. So, if a country has an excessive balance of payment deficit, then the other country, the other country would have a surplus in its balance of payments. What we found after 1973, that when countries adopted the flexible exchange rate system, it was believed that it will solve the nth country problem, because the exchange rate would be now determined by demand and supply of foreign exchange. But we found that instead of solving the problem, we had regular features of the balance of payment crisis, which I will be defining in a short while. So, the topic of today's lecture is models of financial crisis and reforms in the international financial architecture. Now, there are different definitions of crisis. Sachs in 1997 has classified financial crisis as fiscal crisis, exchange crisis and banking crisis according to their field. First, a fiscal crisis means that the situation where the government gets into debt restructuring or default, as it cannot postpone a debt or get a new loan. An exchange crisis means that the countries are not able to maintain the parity in terms of the exchange rate, because it does not have enough of foreign exchange. So, it means depletion of the central bank's foreign exchange reserves as market participants switch domestic currency denominated assets into foreign currency denominated assets. Lastly, a banking crisis is when it hits the commercial bank when they face liquidity shortage or insolvency, as they cannot roll over debt any longer or face a sudden withdrawal of deposits. The last banking crisis that we faced was in the US, where a set of investment banks had a crisis, had a credit crisis, and they faced liquidity shortage. I will be explaining each one of them in detail in a short while. But there are also links between crises. Banking crisis can cause a currency crisis. It's through interventions to increase credit, which can lead to inflation and devaluation of currency. As we saw in the case of US, when most of the banks, investment banks in US were failing, the government intervened, and as a result, it led to an increase in credit, which can lead to inflation and subsequently devaluation of the currency. The currency crisis can also cause banking crisis, because during the currency crisis there is a loss of reserves, which leads to reduction in money supply and credit, and so the commercial banks have to give up loans even to profitable entities. And the sudden capital outflows can cause a banking crisis and a currency crisis. What is the impact of these financial crises? What we saw in the recent case in US, that a collapse in the housing prices in the US in the middle of 2007 led to a rise in defaults in loan repayments, and then rapidly to major losses in financial institutions across the world. Contagion effect was quite prevalent, and the government and the central banks were thinking about the organizational structure and the incentives given to executives to promote profits at all costs. Therein, they found 5 independent investment banks which disappeared during the recent US subprime lending crisis. 2 went bankrupt, 1 was taken over by the commercial bank, and 2 were converted into financial conglomerates. The shadow banking system was at default. In fact, in the US, due to the failure of the banks, had loans amounted to around $6 trillion. That's equivalent to a Chinese economy. It had a contagion effect. The crisis in one country in US had a contagion effect on the others. In India, stock prices declined by 40%, exchange rate declined by 25%. There were loss of reserves, about 40 to 50 billion in reserves in 2 months, and the tightening of credit lines abroad led Indian firms to turn to Indian banking system for credit and demand for foreign exchange. And this has put pressure on the Indian rupee. The Indian rupee depreciated by 25% during 2007-2008. But this financial crisis, as I say that it is a regular phenomena throughout the 20th century. In 1997, around 150 billion moved out of the East Asian countries, which the World Bank defined as the East Asian tigers, in the month of June 1997, leading to deceleration in economic growth rates and heavy depreciation of the exchange rate. There also the contagion effect was quite prevalent. Similarly, you had the Argentinian crisis, you had the Mexican peso crisis, you had the European Monetary Union crisis when the speculators played a role, and when the market participants felt that there should be a crisis, there was a crisis. In 1982, the Latin American countries faced a major crisis. So this crisis, whatever you call it, be it the fiscal crisis, the banking crisis, or the currency crisis, this is prevalent throughout the 20th century. So financial crisis is a regular phenomena of the 20th century. Now, if this has been a regular phenomena of the 20th century, then it raises a number of questions. One needs to diagnose the problem, and for diagnosing, one has to go behind the reasons of the financial crisis. One is the macroeconomic imbalances which are created through government policies. They may be leading to inflation, high budget deficit, high government debt, high interest rates. This leads to an impact on the exchange rate appreciates, the exports decline, balance of payment comes into deficit, and that puts pressure on the exchange rate, and the governments which do not have enough reserves have to move from fixed exchange rate to flexible exchange rate. Another is the microeconomic imbalances and instability. Microeconomic imbalances would mean how are banks generating and investing funds, issues related to corporate governance, hedging instruments which are leading to speculations. And the third is, as in the case of US, we saw financial instability due to the credit shortage created by the fallout of the investment banks. So macroeconomic and microeconomic stability is required along with financial stability. Then the second reason is speculation and self-fulfilling tendencies. This is when the market participants feel that there should be a crisis, there is a crisis. The third is, the reason is asymmetric information, when one side knows more than the other. And the two manifestation of the asymmetric information is moral hazard and adverse selections. These two phenomena create distortions in the economy. Moral hazard is the tendency to take risky actions by the debtors because creditors cannot supervise their actions. So, if the governments are borrowing from outside and they have been backed up by the government, then the countries can take risky actions because they know that if they are not able to pay back the money, the governments can support it. So, the tendency to take risky actions create distortions in the economy. Adverse selection is inability of the governments to select the right borrower. The right borrower would mean that who has enough economic backing to provide the returns. And adverse selection is that because of the asymmetric information, it is not able to find out the right borrowers. The fourth reason is creditors' action. This can also be reasons of the financial crisis. As we saw in 1997, in the case of East Asia, around $150 billion moved out in a single day. This was precipitated by the fact that most of the countries had very high short-term debt to reserves. Short-term debt to reserves had reached around more than 100%. So, this created some sort of a tension in the mind of the creditors because they started feeling that the debtor countries would not be able to pay back their money. As a result, the creditors took out the funds that they had invested. The other reasons for financial crisis is that, as in case of the US, we found that the banks were investing in toxic assets and perverse incentives which created bubbles not backed up by enough capital of their own. So, it was a case where there was bad regulations which led to artificially creating bubbles of the assets, and these interlinkages were quite prevalent and which had an impact on the other economies. Another reason is the global financial imbalances. This has to do with the same nth country problem, where the nth country, if it has a balance of payment deficit, then the other countries would have a balance of payment surplus. But if there is an excessive balance of payment deficit, then the other countries would have an excessive balance of payment surplus. This is what was happening throughout the 80s and the 90s. The US had excessive balance of payment deficit. The excessive balance of payment deficit led to the surplus funds being invested in US, which meant that the interest rates in US were going down, and the US was ready to give loans at low interest rates. So one of the reasons of the US subprime crisis is the global financial imbalances, because surplus funds from Germany, Japan and China were available, and they could easily lend to people who did not have enough economic background or enough economic backing to pay back the money. Then there are some exchange rate distortions which are created, like for example in China they have undermined their exchange rate. As a result, they have a balance of payment surplus with most of the countries. Another reason for financial crisis is that factor accumulation leads to diminishing marginal productivity. If you keep accumulating labor and capital, then the returns, marginal productivity of capital and labor declines. This was the Krugman's hypothesis in 1994, when he predicted that in case of East Asia, because there was not much focus on total factor productivity, he had surmised that the East Asian economies can face a crisis in future, which they did eventually in 1997. Or the recent case in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai, where most of the investments have been done, but they are more of factor accumulation type. They are not there to promote technology innovations. So the simple economic theory which explains this phenomena is that when you accumulate factor, marginal productivity would go down. As a result, the returns go down and there is a deceleration in the growth rates. So these are some reasons for the financial crisis. A proper way of dealing with the financial crisis from the teaching point of view is to put them under different models of financial crisis. The first one is the Krugman's 1979 model. This is also called the first generation model. This is model of macroeconomic imbalances which are created through high fiscal deficit and inadequate reserves. Now I might like to explain this point in the board through a simple definition of the real exchange rates. So the real exchange rate the real exchange rate is given by the nominal exchange rate multiplied by the foreign price level divided by the domestic price level. Now what Krugman was saying in 1979, that due to fiscal imbalances there is an increase in the domestic price levels. So this increases, and if a country wishes to maintain the real exchange rate, then E, which is the nominal exchange rate, it has to go up. So if E is say $1 US, if it is 40 rupees, and if E goes up, it will become $1 US to be equivalent to 50 rupees. That means it leads to appreciation of the foreign currency or depreciation of the domestic currency. Now, in the case when the countries want to maintain a parity, want to maintain the exchange rate, it should have enough reserves to maintain that exchange rate. Otherwise, the currency, its own currency, would depreciate. Now, to maintain that exchange rate, it has to have enough of foreign exchange reserves. So, what Krugman was saying, that in case of high fiscal deficit, it would lead to an increase in prices, and if governments want to maintain the real exchange rate, then it has to increase the nominal exchange rate. But if it was a fixed exchange rate, then it has to maintain that exchange rate at that level. Now, to maintain, for maintaining that exchange rate, it has to have enough of foreign exchange reserves. And in case it finds that it does not have enough of foreign exchange reserves, then it leads to a crisis of confidence. It has to approach the IMF for the required amount of foreign exchange. So, this was the Krugman's model of macroeconomic imbalances created through high fiscal deficit. Another point that I want to explain is that behind this high fiscal deficit are the current account imbalances which are created. This can be explained by simple macroeconomic identity, and that macroeconomic identity is the following. All students of economics know that y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus n, where y is GDP, c is consumption expenditures, I is investment expenditures, g is government expenditures, x is exports, m is imports. Now, the GDP can also be written as consumption plus savings plus taxes, which is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus n. And this would be equivalent to savings minus investment plus p minus g is equal to x minus n. Now, a country which has a current account deficit, that means imports are greater than exports, this can be due to the saving investment imbalances, that means investments are greater than savings, or the government expenditure has been greater than the tax revenue. Now, what Krugman was saying, that in case of high fiscal deficit, that is when the government expenditure is more than taxes, it would lead to the current account imbalances, that means imports are greater than exports, and this would put pressure on the exchange rates. Now, if governments do not have enough foreign exchange reserves to maintain that parity, then it has to move out of the fixed exchange rate and move from fixed exchange rate to flexible exchange rate. So, the high fiscal deficit or high government expenditure would lead to a loss of reserves, and the country would have will move out from the fixed to the flexible exchange rate system. So, this was the first generation model given by Krugman. The second generation models are called the self-fulfilling models given by Radelet and Sachs, Opsfield, Oskan and Sutherland, and Wiplows, and these models are self-fulfilling in the nature, It means that if the market participants feel that there should be a crisis, there will be a crisis. Now, I would again like to go to the board and give a simple model using game theory to explain the second generation models. I am going to discuss 3 cases when the central bank has a lot of reserves, a case when it does not have enough reserves of foreign currency, and a third where the reserves are adequate. So, let us discuss the first case when there are enough reserves. I am taking a hypothetical example. There are 20 units of foreign currency, and in this economy there are 2 investors, A and B. Investor A has 6 units of domestic currency, investor B has 6 units of domestic currency. So, investor A, investor B, investor A has 6 units of domestic currency, investor B has 6 units of domestic currency. Now, we will use simple game theoretic models. In game theory, you can define a game if you have a payoff structure, if you define their strategies, and if you define the players. So, there are 2 players. This is a game theoretic model. There are 2 players, investor A and investor B. There are 2 strategies which are available. The 2 strategies is keep the domestic currency or sell the domestic currency in exchange of foreign currency. The second is when it wants to sell the domestic currency, when it sees that there is probably a case where the domestic currency will depreciate in future. So, it would like to sell the domestic currency in exchange of foreign currencies. So, it is a game theoretic model where there are 2 players, there are 2 strategies, and there is a payoff matrix for each investor. Now, so the model is R is equal to reserves are 20, there is investor A, there is investor B, Now, if both the investors keep the domestic units with them, they do not sell the domestic currency in exchange of foreign currency, then the payoffs that they get is 0 and 0. If the investor B sells domestic currency, then there is a transaction cost of 1 unit. So the payoffs available are 0 and -1. Similarly, for investor A, if it sells the domestic unit, the payoffs available are -1 and 0 because there is a transaction cost of 1 unit. And if both of them sells the domestic currency, then the payoffs available are -1 and -1 because there is a transaction cost. Now we are assuming that the exchange rate is such that the 1 unit of domestic currency is equal to 1 unit of foreign currency. In this example, we will show the Nash equilibrium to be equivalent to, this is a game where the Nash equilibrium is S and S, because by unilaterally deviating from the Nash strategies, all players become worse off. Now in this game there will be no crisis, because even if investor A and investor B sells 6 units of domestic currency each, the central bank will still be left with 8 units of foreign currency. So it can maintain that parity, it can maintain that exchange rates. So this is a game where the central bank has enough foreign exchange reserves. Even if investor A and investor B decides to sell both the currencies, sell the domestic currencies, there will be no crisis. In this, the Nash equilibrium, a small correction is here, it would not like to play S and S, it would like to play K and K. So this will be the Nash equilibrium. This is because by unilaterally deviating from K and K, all players would become worse off. So a case where even if they want to sell the domestic currencies, they will not, it will not lead to any crisis, because the government would still have enough of foreign exchange. Now this is the first case when the central bank has enough reserves. The second case is when the reserves are with the central bank are only equivalent to 6 units of foreign currency. Again, we have two investors, two players. They have two strategies: keep the domestic units, sell the domestic units, keep the domestic units, and sell the domestic units. Now here the payoffs would be, if both of them keep 6 units of domestic currency with them, the payoffs are 0 and 0. But say for example, if investor B sells its 6 units, the central bank will be left with no foreign exchange reserves. This would lead to a crisis where the country has to move from fixed exchange rate to flexible exchange rate. I have defined crisis as when you move out of fixed exchange rates. Now in this case, the payoffs would be 0 for investor A, but investor B, if it sells 6 units, it would lead to depreciation of the currency. Now assume we assume 50% depreciation. If there is 50% depreciation, it would mean that if it exchanges 6 units of domestic currency, it will be left with 3 units, and because there is a transaction cost of 1 unit, it will be finally left with 2 units only. Similarly, investor A, if it sells 6 units, there is a depreciation of 50%, it will be left with 3 units, and 1 unit goes for the transaction cost, it will be left with 2 units only. The payoffs in the case when both sell the domestic currency. Now remember, both have 6 and 6 units, but the central bank has only 6 units only. So the maximum amount of domestic currency that it can sell is 3. There is a depreciation of 50%. So it will be left with 3/2 units. 1 unit goes for the transaction cost, so it will be 3/2 minus 1. So it will be left with half units only. So the payoffs available would be half and half. Now in this case, as opposed to the first case, the Nash equilibrium would work out to be, so the Nash equilibrium in this case would work out to be the strategies S and S, and it would lead to the crisis. This is a game where the central bank does not have enough foreign exchange reserves, and so in this game you will have a crisis because country has moved from fixed to flexible exchange rate. Now you can see the dominant strategy here is selling and selling. Both end up playing strategy sell and sell, because by unilaterally deviating from selling and selling, all players would become worse off. So this is a case where you have a currency crisis. Now third is the case which explains the self-fulfilling nature of the crisis. Again, you have a game. The third case is more interesting when there are adequate level of foreign exchange reserves. The reserves are equivalent to 10 units. Again, there are two investors A and B which have 6 units of domestic currency. They have two strategies, keep and sell. When they both do not sell the domestic currency, the payoffs available are 0 and 0. When one of them sells the domestic currency, there is a transaction cost which is of 1 unit. So the payoff available is 0 and minus 1. Now you can see that if investor B sells 6 units, the central bank still has 4 units with it. So it can maintain that exchange rate. Similarly, investor A, when it sells and the other investor keeps the domestic currency, the payoffs available are minus 1 and 0. Reason being that if it sells 6 units of domestic currency for exchange of 6 units of foreign currency, it still has, the central bank still has 4 units of the foreign exchange reserves to maintain the exchange rates. the payoffs available when both players play sell and sell strategy is 3 by 2, 3 by 2. Reason being that if both of them sell, then the total reserves will be exhausted, and they could maximum sell 5 units of domestic currency each. So this is a case when you have a currency crisis. The payoffs available are that when you sell 5 units of domestic currency, there is an assumption that there is a 50% depreciation. 50% depreciation would mean that you would have 5 by 2 units left, and 1 unit goes for the transaction cost, so you are left with 3 by 2 units. So this is the gain that you would have by playing sell and sell strategy. Now please see, in this game there are two Nash equilibrium. One is K and K, and the other is S and S, because you can see that by unilaterally deviating from the Nash equilibrium strategies, all players become worse off. Now K and K is when they play K and K, there will be no crisis, but when they play S and S, there will be a crisis. Now what self-fulfilling models are saying, that you would have a multiple equilibria. You can have a situation where if the market participants feel that they would, or they would feel that there are enough vulnerabilities in the economy, then they would sell the domestic units in exchange of foreign exchange reserves. As a result, there will be a crisis. Now, this is what happened in 1992 in the European Union, when the market participants felt uneasy about the high unemployment rate. So that vulnerability was translated into a problem of confidence. As a result, everyone wanted to sell the domestic currency in exchange of foreign currency. So despite the countries had enough or adequate foreign exchange reserves, you had a crisis. So this simple game theoretic model shows that you can have a self-fulfilling type of crisis if the market participants feel that there should be a crisis. So this is the second model of the second generation model of financial crisis. The third is the models of moral hazard and inverse selection, which were given by Krugman, Dooley, Radelet and Sachs. These are the third generation models. These models are arguing that the crisis occurs due to asymmetric information. Now to explain the moral hazard, as I said, moral hazard is the tendency to take risky actions by debtors because creditors cannot supervise their actions. Now one of the explanations which were given for the East Asian crisis in 1997 was that the creditors were unaware of what debtors were doing. Debtors were using the money for making buildings where the rents were so high that people were not able to stay there. So the debtors invested in stock markets, in real estates, in places which were highly risky. Now if the creditors are not able to supervise the actions of the debtors, this creates distortions in the economy. So this was one reason which was given for the crisis. Now in case the creditors find that the debtors are taking risky action, it would lead to credit rationing. The moral hazard models and the adverse selection models were popularized by the Nobel laureate Akerlof in the early 70s, where he gave he gave an explanation of the moral hazard and adverse selection through his famous paper on market of lemons. Adverse selection is inability of the creditors to decide about the borrower which has the ability to pay back the money. So, the creditors are unable to decide between bad and good borrowers. This also is due to market asymmetric information. The fourth generation models are given by the Indian economist Bhagwati and Radelet and Sachs, and it talks about the creditors' actions. Rather than blaming the debtors, it is the creditors which have to be blamed, because creditors take out the money when they find that there are enough vulnerabilities which are created in the countries. Like in the case of the East Asian crisis, they found that the short-term debt to reserves had reached very high levels. 25% is normal, but most of these East Asian countries, the Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea, and to some extent say Hong Kong or Singapore, they had very high short-term debt to reserves. So this created some tension in their mind, because what it meant was that the countries did not have enough of liquidity to pay back their money. As a result, the creditors took away $150 billion US dollars in a matter of day in the month of June 1997. So the fourth generation models are talking about the creditors' actions. So then the question is, how do we reform the international financial architecture to reduce vulnerabilities of countries? The first point is about having transparency in reporting of macroeconomic and microeconomic indicators, not merely information but the methodology as well. As we saw in the recent case of US, where most of these investment banks were investing in toxic assets and also simultaneously lending to investors at subprime rates. So there is a prime rate, there is a subprime rate. Subprime rate is lower than the prime rate. So they were lending the money to the investors at a lower rate, and they were converting these loans into securities. So they were quite active in the capital markets. Now all this information was hidden somewhere in the balance sheets, or in some cases it wasn't even available in their balance sheets. So when the bubble burst, when the prices came down heavily of these assets, there was not much adequate information available. So transparency, whether it is reporting of macroeconomic indicators or microeconomic indicators, is essential. Then you need strengthening of financial institutions, including banks. There is already an organization which is called the BIS, Bank for International Settlement, which talks about the capital adequacy standards which have to be maintained in the banks. Now, as we saw in the recent case of US, that in the US, most of the investments which were done in risky assets, they were not backed up by enough capital. So it meant that it was a case of bad regulations. Although the Basel II norms talks about capital adequacy standards, in this case most of the investment banks did not have enough capital adequacy standards. Then Basel II norms also talk about internal risk assessments through value at risk models. Value at risk models calculate the losses due to changes in prices, exchange rates. Now, these value at risk models, they come with an assumption that the variable is normally distributed and there is no interdependence. But you saw that in case of the US subprime crisis, there was so much a correlation of the risks which was not counted for in the value at risk models. So, the value at risk models will not give a correct picture in case you do not take into account the contagion effect. And also you need to take into account the operational risks, the credit risks, and there should be adequate regulations which take into account capital asset ratios, credit expansion and maturity mismatches in boom and recessionary conditions. On the other hand, one also needs strengthening of the IMF in the form of raising their money, that is the special drawing rights, and liberal disbursement policy, because we find that at the time of crisis every institution needs money and they may not be forthcoming, as we saw in the case of moral hazard and adverse selection models. It leads to credit rationing. So, you need more IMF money and you need to have a liberal disbursement policy. And you also should have a global supervisory standards, because as we saw that these risks are all correlated with each other. At the time of the crisis, you need private sector bail-in, as we saw in the case of the Dubai crisis, that one of the other states of UAE intervened and provided the necessary credit when the Dubai city was facing a problem of credit. The other option is nationalization of banks, which was done in the US at the time of the US subprime crisis. But as a long-term solution, one needs to see to it that the self-discipline is prevalent among the banks. There should be adequate supervision and prudential regulations to curb distortions which are created by asymmetric information. There should be coordination of fiscal policies and monetary policies across countries to curb excessive surplus and deficits in the balance of payments. Recently, G20 met. There are 20 influential countries of the world met to decide about coordinating their fiscal and monetary policies to curb this excessive surplus and deficits. Other option is to invest the surplus, that is foreign exchange, which has been created due to global financial imbalances, in infrastructure and social sector needs, to reduce unemployment, to reduce poverty. Questions that need to be answered is what is the adequate level of reserves and what are the instruments of financial intermediaries. Like in India, we have the special purpose vehicles which uses in India's 300 billion foreign exchange reserves to invest in infrastructure. So, you need to find out instruments which can help to deal with some of the inadequacies. So we need to decide about the adequate level of reserves and instruments of financial intermediaries. Like India has a special purpose vehicle which uses the surplus foreign exchange reserves. We have a foreign exchange reserves of 300 billion US dollars, which can be used for purposes like in strengthening the infrastructure, investments in social sector, reducing poverty and unemployment. So it would mean that the surplus funds which were created through global financial imbalances can be used for a very purposeful activity in the economy and also outside. Then the growth of manufacturing sector is necessary so that excessive money does not chase too few goods. This has something to do with what Krugman was saying, that if there is factor accumulation, it would lead to diminishing marginal productivity. So growth of manufacturing sector is necessary along with the other sectors. So total factor productivity growth instead of factor accumulation is necessary, and there should be controls on movement of financial capital and keeping currency competitive so that adequate reserves can be built up. For further research, what one can do is that it can do a regression exercise where an index of crisis can be created based on the amount of reserves that a country has, the interest rates prevailing, and once that crisis indicator is found, it could be regressed on various right hand side variables which are potential determinants of crisis. They can be M2 multiplier, domestic credit to GDP ratio, real interest rates, lending deposit rate ratio, excessive M1 balances, M2 to reserves ratio, fiscal deficit, government debt to GDP, short term flows to GDP, index of financial liberalization, among others. In fact, there have been studies which have used this type of research, and they have found that short term debt to reserves is one of the robust factors which can explain the crisis. And also index of financial liberalization, as we saw that if countries have financial liberalization, it is followed by crisis in some of the countries. But this is not a very robust determinant of the crisis. We can use a time series data of country and use logit and probit analysis, or we can do a pooled exercise. So the final thing is that if it is small, if anything is small, it is sweet and manageable. If it becomes very large, if the banks become very large, if they start doing many things, then it becomes really difficult for these banks to manage things, and this is what happened in the recent US crisis. So it is better to have manageable things, make it small, and do things in an efficient way. Thank you so much.